Once again, good afternoon everyone. Naririnig ba ako, Brother Herwin?
Yes, good
Okay.
afternoon.
So ang topic natin last week is all about the resurrection. But actually, nakulbaan ko sa inyong expectation. Bitaw, but challenging. Challenging siya. So, this afternoon, let's tackle about the predestination, the chapter 6. In Merriam-Webster, predestination, the belief that everything that will happen has already been decided by God or fate and cannot be changed. Yun yung sa pag-ano ng Merriam-Webster. Let's continue. And theological controversy over predestination has caused great confusion in the religious lives of many people. Let us begin by examining the source of his controversy. In the Bible, we find many passages which are often interpreted to mean everything in an individual's life. Prosperity, yung pagbago and decline, yung pagbagsak, happiness and misery, yung kaligayahan at kasakit, salvation and damnation, as well as the rise and fall of nations, comes to the pass exactly as predestined by God. For example, Saint Paul wrote in Romans 8 verse 30, dito in the Bible, those whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. Yun yung sa pag-ano ng the Bibles by Roman 8 verse 30. In Roman 9 verse 15 to 16, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion whom I have compassion. So it's depend not upon man's will or exertion, but upon God's mercy. Yun yung siya sa ano. In Roman 9 verse 21, has Father no right over the day to make cut the same lump, one vessel for beauty and another for menial use. And then we will analyze this verse later in the topic. So, continue natin siya. Yet, we can also find sufficient evidence in the Bible to refute the doctrine of absolute predestination. God warned the first human ancestors not to eat of the fruit in order to prevent their fall. We can deduce from this that the human fall was not the outcome of God's predestination, but rather the result of man's disobedience to God's commandment. If human fall were predestined by God, there will be no reason for him to grieve. Yun yung grieve over fallen human beings who were acting in accordance with this predestination. Since there are ample grounds in the Bible to justify either of these two contrasting doctrines, controversy over the issue of predestination has been inevitable. How can the principle solve this problem? Paano natin siya masolusyonan? We will consider the question of predestination by analyzing it under several topics. Ito yung sa kasunod. In section 1, the predestination of God's will, let us remember that God could not accomplish his purpose of creation due to the human fall. Accordingly, God's will is still to accomplish the purpose of creation. In this sense, God's will is that restoration to be accomplished. To what extent does God predestine His will, the ultimate accomplishment of the purpose of creation? God is absolute being, unique, eternal, and unchanging. Therefore, His will must also be absolute, unique, and eternal, and unchanging. Ito yung will ni God nga, yung parang mag-follow sa Kanya is yung absolute, merong ugaling na absolute, unique, eternal, and unchanging. It is predestined that God's will of perfect love in the family, going in forever with joy in heaven and on earth will happen. God's predestination of His will is absolute. Yun yung sa section 1. This time, let's tackle about the section 2, the predestination of the way in which God's will is fulfilled. But I prepare some clip, hoping that you can, what do you call this? You can, so that you can understand more. Just okay na po ba, Brother Herwin? Kita? Of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So yun yung nangyari, di ba, sa balikan natin yung chapter 2, the human fall, di ba? Kung nakinig lang si Adam and Eve, yung first ancestors natin, naniwala lang sana sila kay God nga, di pagkainin yung fruits, wala sana tayo ngayong problem, di ba? Although God's will to realize the purpose of the providence of restoration is absolute. God predestines the process of its fulfillment of conditionally contingent. Contingent or parang maano mo siya resolution, parang ganon, to take or completely upon the 5% responsibility of the central figure, which must be completed in addition to the 95% responsibility of God. Di ba yung sa atin talaga, very small lang talaga yung gagawin natin, di ba ngayon? Only 5%. Yun dito sa topic na to, di ba? Yung gagawin natin ngayon is only 5%. While kay God is yung 95% talaga yung kay God. But the proportion of 5% is used to indicate that the human portion of responsibility is extremely small when compared to God's portion of responsibility. Yet, for human beings, this 5% is equivalent to 100% of effort. True, di ba, brothers and sisters? Yung very easy lang siya magsalita nga yung 5% lang yung natin, bilis ng ito gawin natin. Yung individual nga kaya individual natin, di ba, hirap i-fulfill, especially yung as a unificationist, di ba, yung natin yung number 1 talaga yung responsibility natin is attending Hondoke. So nagagawa ba natin every day? Parang yun yung very simple lang siya, is we just supposedly we just wake up in the morning, prepare ourselves, and only attend the Hondoke. But hirap na hirap pa rin tayo, di ba? Aminin man natin, di ba? Totoo lang. Maliliit pa nga tayo pagdating sa Hondoke. So, yun siya sa atin. So, the predestination of the fulfillment of God's will is conditional. Yun siya. Continue, the predestination of human beings To what extent does God determine the fate of individual? Absolutely requires that he complete his responsibility. Hence, even though God predestines someone for a particular mission, God 95% of responsibility, of portion of responsibility, and person 5% responsibility must be accomplished together. Supposedly, sabay-sabay siya fulfill before the person can complete his given mission and fulfill God's will. Yun yung ano talaga ni God. If the person does not complete his responsibility, he cannot become the person God has purpose him to be. Yun yun. Hence, predestination of human beings is conditional. The purpose of God's providence of restoration is to restore completely the fallen world to the original world which God intended. Therefore, although the times of their salvation may differ, all fallen people are predestined to save. Yun yung ano kay God talaga nga lahat is masave. Yet, as was the case of God's creation, His providence of salvation, a work of recreation, cannot be completed in an instant. Di lang siya basta-basta nga instant nga ma-fulfill agad. Ang ano lang natin is gawin natin yung POR. God's providence of salvation begins from one point and gradually expands to cover the whole. Therefore, in the providence of salvation, God's first predestines one person to be the central figure and then calls him to a mission. Ano siya? The section 3, the what qualifications should the person possess to merit such a calling? Ano yung mga qualifications na maging ano yung mga qualification na hinanap ni God for na maging chosen. First, he must be born into the chosen people. Yun yung first. Second, he must become from an ancestral line with many good accomplishment. Yun yung pangalawa. He must be endowed with the requisite character. Fourth, he must develop the necessary qualities during his early life. Lastly, he must live in a time and place most fitting to God's need. So yun yung na parang tinaw siya or yung oras na yun na tinaw siya nga fit sa kailangan ni God. So yun yung siyang limang parang qualifications ng isang central figure. One is yung chosen people. Second, ancestral line with good accomplishments. Third, requisite character. Fourth, necessary qualities. And fifth one is time and place fitting to God's need. Yun yung talaga, yung qualifications. Section 4, elucidation of biblical verses which support the doctrine of absolute predestination. Ano talaga yung explanation dito sa Bible na to. So far, we have analyzed the various issues concerning predestination. Next, we shall look again at the biblical verses which seem to suggest that outcome of every undertaking is determined by God's absolute predestination and elucidate their meaning. Ayun yun siya. Di ba? Yun sa nabasa natin kanina sa yung balikan natin yung in the book of Romans 8 verse 29 to 30. Ano yung gali? For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. Those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified. Yun yung ng chosen, di ba? Na niya, for new the predestined call become to justify and glorify yung huli, di ba? God being omniscient foreknows who has the qualification necessary to become a central figure in the providence of restoration. God predestines those who he foreknew, then he calls upon him to fulfill the purpose of the providence, calling the person in God's responsibility, but only when the person completes his responsibility after being called by God, is he justified and then glorified. Yun yung sa explanation dito sa Roman 8 verse 29 to 30. Yun yung sa God's responsibility, di ba? Because the biblical verse does not mention the human portion of responsibility, people may misinterpret it to mean it that all affairs are determined solely by God's absolute predestination. Yun yung tawag nito. Yung sa biblical verses, di ba? Hindi siya nag-mention doon ng human portion of responsibilities nga people may misinterpret it to mean that all affairs are determined solely by God's absolute predestination. Then, last one, I have some movie clip. Only 3 minutes. Last movie clip. Please listen carefully and understand especially the scene here, per scene.
Walang video din.
Oh my God. Okay. Wait. Yun yung brothers and sisters, ano yung sabi ni sabi ni God? Ano yung sabi God said, if you wanna see a miracle, be the miracle, 'di ba? Kasi yun nga sa atin nga mga tao, 'di ba? If we before yung hindi ko pa, especially for me, hindi ko pa alam yung movement, I always do pray lang. Hindi din natin ginathink na yung responsibility ni God, 'di ba? Sa kadami-dami ng mga tao, if lahat nagpe-pray, 'di ba? Dapat gawin talaga natin yung makaya na yung natin yung pwede nating magawa, hindi na tayo maghintay pa kay God. Like fulfilling our 5% of responsibility. Yun siyang ibig sabihin sa movie na to. If you wanna see a miracle, be the miracle, 'di ba? Therefore, the accomplishment of God's will in the fulfillment of the purpose of the providence of restoration depends upon God's portion of responsibility and human's portion of responsibility. So, yun siya, di ba? Yun lang talaga yung natin, nga ma-accomplish natin yung God's will of God. At the same time, yung POR natin as individual. So, So yun yun, brothers and sisters. Thank you so much.